The education during the war, I think, was just as good as in normal times. We had to work very hard and sit lots of exams and got our marks, and eventually got school leaving certificates. The school corps, of course, was quite prominent. It was very fashionable for the young lads to get dressed up in army uniform. I prefer to do the scouts rather than the school corps, but there's 6.5 dozen. Outside school, rationing was a big problem. We had to have ration books and have them marked or stamps taken out for almost everything we bought. There was usually plenty of bread and plenty of potatoes, but even those sometimes ran out. We got very small supplies of butter, sugar and eggs and cheese, hardly enough to last a day in peacetime. Was a week's ration. Never mind, we got on with it, and one could get extras like tin sardines, for which one had to give out points out of our ration book. Points were a system that covered all extras like syrup. Then another feature of the war was all the troops on the trams. Wherever one went, the trams were always full of sailors and soldiers and airmen, and particularly at the station, if one went to meet a friend, the trains were packed with soldiers, sailors and airmen. Of course, hardly anybody in civilian clothes was travelling anywhere. Nobody was going for holidays or weekends away. We only had two relatives away in the war. We had an uncle who was an engineer in Burma, and we were always worried as to how he was getting on, but he survived the war, fortunately. And we had an aunt who was a senior nurse, and she was in the battles up through Italy. And I think she was reasonably comfortable, but I imagine they had to work very hard and long hours and unusual hours. The entertainment during the war was a bit funny because, of course, there was no television then. Films were popular, but you couldn't get news on television the way we do nowadays. To get news, one went to a movie-tone cinema where they had a repeat cycle of news, and you watched it for an hour and then it was repeated again. A lot of the news possibly wasn't real. For instance, they'd show battle scenes as though one was seeing the Battle of Alamein, but I'm not sure that one was actually seeing that particular battle. Nevertheless, it made us feel we were being kept informed. We were discouraged from taking holidays during the war because, again, that was using up precious coal travelling in trains, but nearly always we went back up to the north of Scotland to stay with our relatives, and that was a great, great treat. Other people went to other places, but on the whole there was very little travelling. My father in the Ministry of Supply started his work in Edinburgh, but he was later posted to Glasgow and later to Nottingham, so he used to commute at weekends, coming back home for weekends from Glasgow, but couldn't get back from Nottingham quite so often. On the whole, he seemed to enjoy life doing these jobs, but I think at the end of the war he was quite glad that it had finished. As the war progressed and we got older, of course, we youngsters were able to take more and more interest in the actual facts of the war. To start with, we just had grown-ups sounding pessimistic about sinking of battleships, the Hood and the Prince of Wales and the Dunkirk and the losses there, and then the battles in Alamein. But as things got a bit better, it all sounded more cheerful. We never had any doubts about careers. It was just assumed that when we left school we would go into the Army, Navy or the Air Force. One never had careers advisors, and we never heard any youngsters quibbling about what they did or didn't want to do. On the whole, I suppose we wanted peace. But it's quite funny when you're growing up with a life of rationing and austerity, you don't really think about a more luxuriant lifestyle. Towards the end of the war in 1945, of course, I was 12 and maturing then, keen to play sports, but as I said before, we couldn't get sports equipment, but we made the best of it. I played hockey and a bit of tennis and had to work harder and harder. Then finally, in 1949, we had an exchange of pupils in a school in Paris, and I went over to Paris for 6 weeks and tried to improve my French unsuccessfully, but I enjoyed it all and learned a lot about France and the French. And the chap I was exchanging with, he came and stayed with my mother. At the end of the war in 1946, there was a great shortage of rubber in the world, and so the Ministry of Supply was very keen that my father and his partner should go back out to Vietnam to get the rubber plantations going, and he travelled out there. In those days it was a funny sort of journey because there weren't fast jets. Before the war everybody just travelled by sea. But after the war he was able to be flown out to Vietnam on a flying boat, a Sunderland flying boat, which had a limited distance. I think they flew to Marseille for the first day, spent a night in Marseille, and then they flew on to Port Said for the next day, and on to Colombo, a long journey, but quite exciting for them. Back at home, school was normal, but the rationing persisted and didn't really end until 1952. Furthermore, while rationing persisted and there was austerity in clothes you could buy, there was also battles going on. We were hearing all about the Palestinian troubles, and we were all hearing about the war in Korea. And for a young person, it was very easy to think that world war was a permanent state of affairs. Fashion and clothes began to improve in the late 40s. Up to then, we went around in hard-wearing, austere clothes and simple, rough shoes, and nobody expected to have better clothes than that. I remember an aunt of mine getting married shortly after the end of the war, and she had a pair of silk stockings, which was thought to be the height of luxury for her wedding, and our rough mongrel dog had scratched them and torn them to shreds just before the ceremony. She was none too pleased about that. However, life changed a bit after the end of the war, because although there's still a lot of austerity, there were no more battles going on, and for most people we weren't living in fear of losing a relative or hearing of some awful tragedy. We'd already heard about the tragedy of Belsen and Auschwitz, and we'd seen films of the grotesque piles of bodies that had died of starvation or in the gas chambers. But that was all over. I think in general we probably felt sorry for the Germans because they had had so much awful warfare actually on their soil, with the Russians invading from the east and the British and Americans from the west. And life must have been much harder for them in the 40s than it was for us. I don't think the war has really left any permanent scar in people who had to live through it. For those who are in the armed forces, there may well have been much more of a scar because they really saw horrible tragedies, battle on the battlefield. But schoolboys at that time were spared all that. Odd enough, nowadays they think that children who draw pictures of planes dive bombing and so on are suffering from war stress. Well, we were always making such drawings as a happy, frequent pastime if we couldn't think of anything else to do. But we didn't feel we were suffering from any post-traumatic stress in any way whatsoever. Can I stop there?